In 2013, a geneticist in Scotland sat staring at a result he had run 3 separate times, and 3 separate times the machine told him the same impossible thing. He was not looking at the DNA of a stranger. He was looking at the maternal bloodline of the most photographed woman of the 20th century. A woman whose face had sold more magazines than any monarch in history, whose every ancestor had supposedly been traced and catalogued and bound into the pages of England's grandest aristocratic record books. And what he found in her cells should not have been there. A genetic marker so rare that in a database of 65,000 people, only 14 human beings on the planet carried it. 13 of them lived in India. 1 lived in Nepal. Not a single one lived anywhere in Europe. And yet, there it was, sitting quietly in the direct maternal line of Diana, Princess of Wales. He ran it again. The result didn't change. He had 2 samples from 2 different living relatives who had never met each other, and both carried the same marker independently, which meant it wasn't an error. It wasn't contamination. It wasn't a smudge on a slide. It was real. It was true. And it had been hiding in the most famous bloodline in Britain for over 200 years. Here's the thing you need to understand before we go any further. This story has 2 halves, and both of them will unsettle you. The first is a genetic discovery so statistically improbable that the scientist himself had to convince his own colleagues he hadn't made a mistake. The second is the human being behind that marker, a woman who was erased so completely, so deliberately, that even her own descendants, the people walking around with her DNA stitched into every cell of their bodies, had no idea she had ever existed. They believed a different story, a polished, respectable, comfortable lie that had been passed down at family dinners for 7 generations. The biology said one thing, the family said another, and for 2 centuries, those 2 stories traveled side by side, never touching, never colliding, until a little plastic tube of saliva brought them crashing together. So, let's start where the world thought it knew everything. By 1981, when a shy 20-year-old named Diana Frances Spencer walked up the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral to marry the future King of England, her ancestry had been studied to exhaustion. Genealogists treated the Spencers as almost a model English aristocratic family. Old money, old land, old blood, traceable back through dukes and earls, and the kind of names that filled the index pages of peerage volumes. The assumption everyone made, the assumption nobody even bothered to question, was that her bloodline was about as purely English as a bloodline could possibly be. Centuries of country estates, centuries of careful marriages between the right families, centuries of what the era smugly called good breeding. And here's the deal. That assumption wasn't just lazy. It was the entire foundation of how the British aristocracy understood itself. The idea that these families were genetically distinct, that their blood was somehow cleaner, older, more native than everyone else's, that idea was the spine that held the whole class system upright. So, when 2 of Diana's maternal relatives, both of them third cousins of her mother, spat into a tube as part of a genetic genealogy project, nobody expected the results to do anything but confirm what the record books already said. They expected to see the unbroken English line stretching back into the green hills of the past. Instead, the test reached back through that line, generation after generation, mother to mother to mother, and somewhere around 7 generations back, it ran into something the record books had quietly deleted. Now pay attention to this, because to understand why this discovery is so airtight, you have to understand why these particular relatives were chosen, and why the type of DNA being tested matters so enormously. Both women descended from Diana's mother's side through an unbroken chain of mothers and daughters. And the test wasn't looking at ordinary DNA, the kind that gets shuffled and remixed every single generation. Half from your father, half from your mother, scrambled like a deck of cards. It was looking at mitochondrial DNA. And mitochondrial DNA plays by completely different rules. Think about that for a second. Mitochondrial DNA passes down only through the female line, from a mother to all of her children, but only her daughters pass it on to the next generation. It does not mix. It does not blend with the father's contribution. It passes intact, virtually unchanged, like a sealed letter handed down hand to hand across the centuries. A letter that no man marrying into the family could ever touch, alter, or contaminate. Every husband who entered the Spencer line over 200 years left his fingerprints all over the rest of the genome, but the mitochondrial line ran straight past them, untouched, sealed, incorruptible, which makes it the closest thing genetics has to a tamper-proof record. It is a thread you can follow backward through time, mother by mother, with absolute confidence that no one rewrote it along the way. And that's exactly what makes this so devastating, because while the family was busy rewriting the paper records, and they were, as you'll soon see, the one record they could never reach, the one buried inside the body itself, kept telling the truth. The paper said European. The blood said something else entirely. The marker the geneticist found belongs to a haplogroup called R30b, and R30b, along with all of its branches, is South Asian. Not occasionally South Asian, not maybe South Asian, entirely, unambiguously, exclusively South Asian in origin, with no plausible alternative explanation anywhere on the table. It does not appear in native European populations. populations. It does not pop up scattered across the Mediterranean or hidden in some forgotten corner of the Caucasus. It comes from the Indian subcontinent, full stop. So, when it surfaced in the sealed maternal line of an English princess, it could mean only one thing. At some point, roughly 7 generations before Diana was born, a woman of South Asian ancestry had married, or more precisely, had entered that direct maternal line. A woman whose existence had been carefully, methodically smoothed out of the official story until she became a kind of ghost in her own family tree. She had a name. We know it now, Eliza Kawark, and for more than 200 years, that name appeared in no Spencer genealogy that mattered, in none of the prestigious record books, in none of the biographies that lined up to celebrate Diana's pedigree when she married into the royal family. She had been erased so thoroughly, so successfully, that the very people carrying her DNA didn't know she was the source of it. So who was she, this woman who didn't exist? Eliza Kawark was born around 1790 in a city called Surat on the western coast of India. And if you want to understand how a woman ends up scrubbed out of one of the most documented family trees in the world, you have to first understand the place that made her. Surat in the late 18th century was not some sleepy backwater. It was loud. It was crowded. It was one of the busiest port cities on the entire subcontinent, a tangle of warehouses and wharves where the sea breeze carried the smell of salt and tar and crates of pepper, indigo, and raw cotton waiting to be loaded onto ships bound for Europe. Traders from a dozen nations walked those streets, Persians, Armenians, Portuguese, Dutch, and increasingly the men of the British East India Company, who arrived hungry, ambitious, and looking to make their fortunes far from the cold drawing rooms of home. Into that world, Eliza was born. And here's where it gets complicated, beautifully, revealingly complicated, because Eliza Kawark carried 2 heritages, and the family would later weaponize one to hide the other. Pay attention to this because it's the hinge the entire cover-up turns on. Eliza's father carried an Armenian name, Kawark, and Eliza herself, when she put pen to paper, signed her letters not in English, not in any Indian script, but in elegant Armenian characters. Now, in the cold logic of colonial society, that one detail was pure gold, because to be Armenian was to be Christian. To be Armenian was to be, in the eyes of the British, respectable, civilized, European adjacent, the kind of background a man could quietly fold into his family story without too much scandal. Armenian was a heritage you could admit to at dinner. But here's the catch. Here's the thing that one signature could conceal, but the blood inside her could not. Eliza's mother's line, the maternal line, the one that carries mitochondrial DNA down intact from mother to daughter to daughter. That line was South Asian. That was the line carrying R30B. So while the Armenian name sat proudly on the surface, visible, useful, a convenient half-truth, the deeper truth ran underneath it, sealed inside every cell of her body, waiting 200 years for a geneticist with a saliva swab to finally read it out loud. Think about that for a second. The cover story and the buried truth were both genuinely hers. The lie wasn't even fully a lie. It was a selective truth. Armenian, yes, on her father's side, chosen precisely because it could be used to drown out the part that colonial society found unacceptable. That is a far more insidious kind of erasure than a simple fabrication. You don't invent something out of nothing. You just take the convenient half of a person and let the inconvenient half disappear. And now we come to the man who walked into Eliza's life and changed everything. His name was Theodore Forbes, a Scotsman, a merchant of the East India Company who arrived in Surat sometime around 1809, young and ambitious, and stationed thousands of miles from anyone who knew him. And there, in that humid, bustling port city, Theodore and Eliza came together. The official version, the version that would later be written down in cold ink, described Eliza as Forbes's housekeeper, his domestic, a servant in his home. And maybe, in the narrowest technical sense, that was a title someone wrote on a document somewhere. But the truth of what passed between them was something else entirely. And we know this because the truth survives. It survives in their 2 children, a daughter, Catherine, born in 1812, and a son, Alexander. And it survives in the letters, because Eliza was not a maid who swept his floors. The surviving correspondence shows a woman who translated for Forbes, who moved between languages and communities that he, a foreigner, could never have navigated alone. She facilitated his contacts. She helped him do business in a place where business depended entirely on trust, on knowing who to talk to and how to talk to them. In a city where a company man's success or failure rested on relationships, Eliza was, in every meaningful sense, his partner, his door into a world that would have stayed closed to him forever. For a few years in Surat, that arrangement worked. The children grew. The household ran. And here's the part that's easy to miss across the distance of 2 centuries. For a window of time, this was something close to a family. A man, a woman, 2 small children in a house near the sea. Whatever the documents called it, that's what it was. But colonial society was changing, and it was changing in a direction that left no room for a woman like Eliza. Here's the deal. In the earliest years of British expansion in India, relationships between company men and Indian women were common, even unremarkable. Many of those men, far from home for decades, built lives and families families with local women, and society more or less looked the other way. But as the decades wore on, the rules tightened. The empire grew more rigid, more obsessed with racial hierarchy, more determined to draw hard lines between ruler and ruled, between European and Indian, between what was respectable and what would ruin a man's prospects. And as Theodore Forbes's career advanced, as he climbed toward the prize of a partnership in Bombay, the kind of position that could make a man wealthy and established for life, the calculus around Eliza shifted. A rising company partner with a fortune in front of him could not afford a domestic complication. A common-law wife of Indian blood, however much she had helped build that fortune, however many years they had spent together, however many children they shared, she had become, in the brutal arithmetic of the time, a liability, an obstacle to the kind of life Bombay society would let him have. And so, Theodore Forbes made his choice. He left her. He left Surat, and he left Eliza, and he left their children behind in that port city, and he went to build a new life in Bombay alone, a respectable life, a social life, the life of a company man on the rise. And get this, he didn't even tell her himself. He didn't sit across from her and explain. As the arrangements were made for the children's futures, as decisions were taken about where they would go and what would become of them, Forbes managed it all at a distance through intermediaries, through other people's hands and other people's letters, as though writing to Eliza directly was a thing a man in his position could no longer be seen to do. The woman who had translated his world for him was now a person he could only speak to through go-betweens, like a debt being quietly settled, like a chapter being closed before anyone important could read it. Now think about that for a second. Think about what it would have meant to be Eliza in those months. The man who had shared her bed and her years and her children was suddenly a silence on the other side of a wall she could not climb. She was still in the same city. She was still alive, still well, still raising the two small people they had made together. And the messages that came to her now came secondhand, filtered, official, the language of arrangements rather than affection. She must have understood very quickly what was happening. A woman that perceptive, a woman who had read men and moods and the politics of a trading port well enough to be useful to a merchant, she would have read this too. She would have known what it meant when the letter stopped coming in his hand. And here's where the story stops being something you analyze and becomes something you feel. Because after Forbes was gone, after the years had passed and the man himself had died, a packet of letters surfaced. Far away in Scotland, on the family estate, among the papers and effects that come with a man's death, someone found a small bundle of correspondence written in a script no one in that cold northern house could read. Strange characters, unfamiliar hands, letters that had crossed an ocean and outlived the man they concerned. Sitting in a drawer like a sealed door no one bothered to open. They were Eliza's letters. And when, generations later, they were finally translated, here is what they revealed. Eliza could not write English herself or could not write it well enough for this. So, she had done what people in that world did. She found a scribe, a Parsi scribe in Surat, someone who could take her words and set them down on paper. And she dictated to him in the broken, halting English of a woman speaking a language that was never fully hers. And then, at the bottom of each letter, in the one script she could form with her own hand, she signed her name in Armenian. That detail again, the Armenian thread woven right through the most intimate act she had, the signing of her own name to a plea for her own child. Because that's what these letters were. Please, letter after letter, the same ache underneath the careful dictated words. She wanted to see her daughter. Catherine was going to be taken from her, sent across the sea to Scotland, to a country Eliza had never seen and would never see, to be raised by people Eliza would never meet, in a world that had already decided her mother did not belong in it. And Eliza, knowing this, knowing she could not stop it, asked for the only thing left to ask for, to see the girl one more time, to hold her once before the ship took her, to have a final hour with the daughter she had carried and fed and raised in that house near the water. Imagine writing that. Imagine speaking those words to a stranger so he could write them down for you in a language that wasn't yours because the only person who needed to hear them had stopped listening. Imagine signing your own name to a request to say goodbye to your own child and then waiting day after day for an answer that you already suspected would never be the one you wanted. And it wasn't. When Theodore Forbes died at sea in 1820, the documents that settled his affairs made the final shape of the thing brutally, coldly clear. In his will, Eliza, the woman he had lived with, the mother of his children, the partner who had translated his deals and smoothed his path through a foreign country, Eliza was named as nothing more than his housekeeper, a servant, a line item. And Catherine, their daughter, the little girl with her mother's blood running quietly in her cells, was described as his reputed natural daughter. Reputed, natural, the careful, dehumanizing vocabulary of a society that had words for children like her, words designed to keep them at arm's length from anything they might inherit, from any name they might claim. And then the severing came, exactly as Eliza had feared. 8 years old. That's how old Catherine was when they put her on a ship. 8 years old. Taken from the only home she had ever known. From the heat and the noise and the smells of the port city. From the mother who had begged in letter after letter just to see her one more time. And sent across the world to a gray country full of strangers who shared her father's blood and none of her mother's. She would grow up in Scotland. She would be made into someone new, and she would never see Eliza again. Not once. The goodbye Eliza pleaded for, we don't know for certain that she got it. The line that survives in those letters is the asking, not the answer. There were 2 children, remember? Catherine had a brother, Alexander. And here's the detail that twists the knife in a different direction. Alexander was also sent to Scotland, also pulled out of his world and dropped into the cold. But Alexander, it turned out, could not bear it. He was homesick. Homesick the way only a child torn from everything can be. A deep and undentable longing for the place and the warmth and the life that had been taken from him. And so, eventually they sent him back to India, back toward home. But not the girl. They kept the girl. Think about that for a second. The boy who could not stop grieving for India was returned to it. And the daughter, the one carrying that ancient maternal thread, the one whose cells held a marker that would one day astonish a geneticist 200 years in the future, she was the one they held on. She was the one kept in Scotland, kept in the family, kept and reshaped and folded into a new identity until the India in her was something no one spoke of, and in time something no one even remembered. The thread that would lead generation by generation, daughter by daughter, all the way down to a woman the entire world would one day know by a single name. That thread stayed in the cold country. It survived precisely because they refused to let her go home. And Catherine grew. She grew up in Scotland, and she did the thing that survival demanded of her. She learned to live as though India had never existed at all, as though there had never been a port city, never been a mother dictating letters to a Parsi scribe, never been a goodbye begged for across an ocean. She married, and she married well, the way a girl folded carefully into the right family was meant to. And in marrying well, in becoming respectable, in becoming acceptably, unquestionably one of them, she carried something forward that none of them could see and that she herself almost certainly did not understand. In every cell of her body, untouched and unaltered, she carried Eliza. She carried the marker. She carried the sealed letter that no will, no ship, no relabeling, no 2 centuries silence could ever open or edit or erase. And so it passed, the way it always passes, quietly, invisibly, mother to daughter to daughter. From Catherine it went down through the generations, each woman handing it on without ever knowing she held it. The way you hand on the color of your eyes without meaning to. Down through the years it traveled, through a daughter and then her daughter, down to a woman named Ruth, and from Ruth to a woman named Frances. And from Frances, on the 1st of July in 1961, came a baby girl. They named her Diana. Diana Frances Spencer. And inside that infant, in the mitochondria of every single cell, sat the unbroken thread that ran straight back to a port city on the western coast of India. To a woman who signed her letters in Armenian script and begged to see her child one last time. Now, here is the part that should genuinely stop you. Because when those results came back, when the science finally spoke, someone had to tell the family. And one of the people who heard it was Diana's own maternal aunt, a woman who had lived her whole life inside the family story, the Armenian story, the respectable story passed down at dinner tables for 200 years. And her reaction wasn't horror, it wasn't shame, it was delight, surprise and genuine warm delight at the idea that there was Indian heritage in the line, that this hidden woman had been there all along. Think about what that means. For 2 centuries, this family had carried Eliza's actual DNA in their bodies while passing down a story that erased her. The biological truth and the family myth traveled side by side in the very same people for 200 years. The cells telling one tale, the dinner table telling another, and no one able to hear the contradiction until a laboratory in Edinburgh forced the 2 to finally meet. And get this, once the curtain came up, the ironies kept stacking. Because long before any of this, the keepers of the great pedigrees, the people whose entire profession is bloodlines, had already declared something extraordinary, that Diana, the bride who married into the monarchy, actually carried more English royal blood than the prince she married. It flowed to her through the tangled, illegitimate descendants of an old king's mistresses, through dukes whose titles came from love affairs and not from marriage. She also descended from a tragic Queen of Scots. The royal family she joined had a surname that had been German until they quietly renamed themselves Windsor in a more convenient century. So, the woman the establishment received as the outsider, the one whose family had spent 200 years hiding a port city ancestor to seem European enough, she was, by the cold arithmetic of bloodlines, more rooted in this island's old royal line than the throne itself. But the marker is what undoes everything. Because that thread didn't stop with Diana. It passed once more mother to son, to her elder boy, the future king. He carries it. The same rare signature that began in Gujarat, in the body of a woman the family spent generations pretending didn't exist, now sits in the cells of a man destined to wear the crown, making him, in all likelihood, the first British monarch with proven Indian ancestry running straight through his maternal line. The living cousins who were tested showed only a faint trace of South Asian ancestry in the broad measure, somewhere under 1%, the way 7 generations dilute everything except the one thing that doesn't dilute. And that one thing, the mitochondrial thread, the sealed letter, it ends here, because it only ever passes through mothers. A king cannot hand it down. So Eliza's marker, which survived a will, a separation, an ocean, a relabeling, and 200 years of careful forgetting, will not pass to his children. It travels as far as him and his brother, and then it goes quiet. The thread that refused to die because they refused to let her daughter go home will finally, gently, come to rest. So here is what this story actually leaves us with. Not a fun fact about a haplogroup, not a piece of royal trivia for a quiz night. What the DNA exposed is that a whole architecture of shame, the colonial arithmetic that decided whose blood was a liability and whose was an asset, the single word swapped into a record to make a woman acceptable, the brutal calculus that returned a grieving boy but kept a useful girl. All of it was a lie laid over a human being. Eliza was real. She loved. She translated. She negotiated. She begged. And the empire that needed her gone could erase her from the paper, but it could not reach into the cell. It could not touch the one record she left in the only ink that cannot be altered. Her own daughter and her daughter's daughter. All the way down to the most photographed woman of her century and onward to a future king. They tried to make her disappear. The science made her impossible to forget. And maybe that's the quiet justice of it. That the thing they were ashamed of is the thing that survived. While the lie they invented to replace her is the part that's now coming apart in everyone's hands. So, I want to hear from you. If a single word in a dusty record could hide a woman like Eliza for 2 centuries, and if her own DNA was the thing that finally brought her back, then whose story do you think is still buried right now waiting in some living descendant cells for a test that has not been run yet? Tell me in the comments which historical figure's hidden bloodline you would want science to crack open next, and who you think the world might find hiding inside it.